Thanks for the talk. I really agree with a lot of this, and it really opens up a lot of interesting questions. So I'm also totally on board with the view that we can sort of ask different questions about a system or a mechanism, and that as we even maybe quite subtly change the question we're asking or the way we're asking a question, we sort of bring different elements of the system or the mechanism to the forefront. I'm really super on board with that, and you gave a really in a way a very nice taxonomy of ways of looking at things. But I have I guess some worries about it, and one is a very big picture one, and it sort of starts out from the worry that we can kind of endlessly get more or less fine-grained about the phenomenon we're looking at, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a lot of more types of questions we could ask than the ones that you've raised. For instance, people are really interested in why questions, and there's both a teleological aspect to that, and there's a design principle aspect. People are really interested in dynamics and bringing those kinds of models to bear on the issue. I've argued that when we are interested in sort of explaining particulars of phenomena, we need to build in sort of quantitative patterns to the standard qualitative mechanistic organization. So on the one hand, I worry that when we open up the box to this perspective of question asking, we're going to get a lot more types of questions than the ones you've talked about. And on the other hand, I worry that at some level, there's sometimes not really that much difference between them. So I'm kind of going back and forth between these things. So let me try to nail this down with a couple of specific questions. One thing that I wasn't totally sure about was exactly what's different between the underlying and the productive explanations. So if there's going to be something, if these are going to be very different sort of approaches or takes on things, then they should have something very different about how the explanation is structured. But in the case of the death versus the dying, right? It's not really clear to me exactly what would be very different about the cases that you talked about. It was not really clear to me what would be very different about the explanations of those two things. It seems like we'd cite some of the same stuff. And I think that this extends maybe to the maintaining mechanisms as well. So one thing we could ask about, for instance, circadian rhythms is why they occur, right? So why does an intracellular mechanism produce a self-sustaining circadian rhythm? But another thing we could do is ask, well, why does the concentration of period proteins go down at this particular time? So that's a change in how fine-grainedly we're looking at the phenomenon. But we're not going to cite sort of very different things. We're just going to kind of focus in on this part. And the explanation for why the period protein concentration goes down at a particular time is going to bring in all of that stuff that you want to call maintaining mechanisms, right? Because the things that are doing the maintaining, the interlocking feedback loops of gene regulation, are going to be the things that are involved in producing that particular aspect of the phenomenon, namely period concentrations going down. So what's my question? So can you? I'm stuck in this kind of in-between place where I worry, like, if we are really friendly to this, we'll end up with way more questions than you've asked. But one could also be really skeptical about whether the kinds of explanations you're trying to articulate are that different to begin with.
Okay, so let me start with your first question. The issue with more questions, more grains being available, or it being possible to ask about always finer grain questions and also asking theological questions. So yes, that's true, obviously. And I would add to this story that for any of the mechanisms that I looked at here, these are mechanisms that are already in place, right? We assume the mechanism's there and now we study it and we can discover it. But that's simplified. Obviously, the mechanism has to come into place, and part of the story of discovering how it comes into place will also involve finding out how it actually works. But it's a separate set of questions to ask, how did these mechanisms come to be? And I would want to separate those from how does the mechanism operate, at least for the purpose of analyzing. Well, when integrating later on, say you have the history of a certain genetic trait or something, then obviously you, on one hand, you'll ask, how does this specific genetic trait come to be in the population? Was it a specific mutation, or was it a specific selection force that was the reason why people with this genetic trait were selected, or organisms rather than people? And you can ask all of that, fine, but that's sort of before the story that I told today, or that I was trying to tell. And then, as to your, so is that helpful with regard to the first question?
Well, so it is. I mean, I'm thinking more. So of course, there's people who want to talk about evolutionary teleology, or want to talk about development. But I was thinking more along the lines of people like Colin Rice and I think Andrew Wouters and Sarah Green and colleagues have picked this up. And Van Eck and Menes have a paper on this. Sort of. So there's an attempt to sort of bring these teleological considerations into analysis of the mechanism by looking at general design principles, right? So starting to analyze the mechanism as a type of network structure,
yep,
right, that might be instantiated elsewhere, and there's a environmental reason, not necessarily an evolutionary reason. There's an environmental reason why systems of these varieties tend to exhibit these design principles, right? So that's a case where this kind of consideration gets sort of closer to the specific analysis of how the mechanism is doing its thing.
Yeah. So, but I think it's not a problem for me. It would just be an extension to bring that in as well, to say, well, the mosaic that we're trying to create when integrating all these different findings, let's call them, or different discoveries, it's even larger because, like, take this picture. You can still see my screen, right?
I can, yeah.
So take this picture and say, for instance, we're looking at the mechanism for this. Then obviously we can also ask, well, how did this mechanism come about? And you can give the causal story or other story. So you can give an explanation how that thing came to be there that you're trying to explain. And then you can obviously bring in something like environmental constraints on how organisms evolved. It doesn't have to be all genes. I just think it's yet a separate story to talk about how the mechanisms came to be, as opposed to, well, how do they work now? And I would just say it's yet another project, yes. With regard to your second question, are these mechanisms even all that different? Well, what's definitely different is what we consider the explanandum, or what the phenomenon that we are trying to explain, and how that relates to the mechanism. So that's the thing I tried to highlight with the colors, and I'm just going to one slide here where you can see it pretty clearly. So the difference is not so much the kinds of components you will have in the explanans. If you think of the lactose metabolism, for instance, you will, whether you are asking for how did the sugar come to be split, or how does lactose metabolism work, in both cases you're going to cite RNA polymerase, you're going to cite the repressor, you're going to be talking about something binding to the repressor and it being removed or not being removed. So the elements of the explanans are going to be the same, but the phenomenon they aim to explain is going to be different in how they relate to it. And that's the crucial bit.
So this is the part I guess I'm not really getting. So the death versus the dying, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, that just sounds like taking one process. And this is interesting because, I mean, I've got, this is a horrible way to label these intuitions, but stemming off of Carl's talk last time, I've got flat Earth intuitions, right? So when I look at that, I want to say, like, okay, here's this causal process in the world. At the end of it, the dude is dead. Like, he's dead now.
Yeah, but he's dead only once, right? He's not dying.
Yeah, right. But so I'm having a hard time saying, well, we can agree there's just one event in the world, but there's two very distinct phenomena. That doesn't really hit home for me.
No, there's one process in the end, and there's one process in the world, but what you pick out as the phenomenon, that's the difference. So in the case where you want to explain his death, you're trying to explain that, like, out of that overall process, you want to explain the final stage. If you asking for how he was dying or want to explain his dying, you are looking at the whole thing. So you're just looking at the whole chunk rather than the thing in the end.
But okay, fair enough. But that sounds like a different thing. That is a point about how fine or coarse-grainedly we draw a circle around the temporal process. I mean, I guess maybe this is terminological, but I would want to say we draw that circle more coarse-grainedly or more fine-grainedly. That's not necessarily the same as picking out very different types of phenomena. But maybe we agree, and it's just a terminological thing here.
So yes, we pick out different. Well, not really, because the explanation. So the elements of the explanation are going to be like in the same spatiotemporal area. They're going to concern the same thing. It's just, what is it that I take to be explaining? And then, depending on what I focus on, I will either construe that explanandum as the result that's causally connected to all the stuff that happened before, or I will construe the different stages as the components in the overall mechanism. So for me, levels are a matter of taking different perspectives. Maybe that helps to answer the question. So if we move to a higher level, if we are causal grained, then to me, that's just like, yeah, we're looking from a different perspective at the world. Thus, things look like, a thing that's actually a lot of things now looks like one, like the dying up here that we are looking at actually has different components, and there are these causal chains. Does that help somehow? Does it clarify?
Maybe. I'm not totally convinced yet, but maybe I should not beat that horse anymore. Maybe we can come back to it after other tests.
I'm sorry, we haven't been able to get my webcam to work. My computer seems hijacked for something else I can't. But I enjoyed your paper and your presentation very much. It has gone through a number of different editions, and I'm happy to see this latest one. So I guess I really enjoyed the first part of the talk about producing and maintaining. You're quite right, as you say in the paper. Carl was always more interested in the levels and in talking about, producing and underlying. Carl was always interested in talking about underlying because he was doing multi-levels in neuroscience. And I was more interested in producing because I was indeed producing like protein synthesis. That was one of the major case studies I've worked on. So I think you've integrated them in a way that he and I did never quite see. And so that I do think is a nice contribution of your paper. And I'm very glad to see the emphasis you place on the way the phenomenon is characterized. Some people sort of don't get that point, and it's an important one, and you really do emphasize it well here. Depending on how you characterize the phenomenon, you'll be looking for a different type of mechanism. And I think that's right about the producing and underlying, whether you're looking at the end product of the overall thing that will capture all of the components. So I guess I maybe disagree with Dan on that point, if I understood his point. Excuse me. What I want to talk about is maintaining. And you're quite right. Not much has been done on this in the literature that I know of, and we certainly just did it as a toss-off in the book. Partly because some people had said that, well, when you're maintaining something at an equilibrium or at a set point, that's going to be very different from the kinds of mechanisms you all are talking about going from beginning to end. And that's right. It is a continuous process, and I like your introducing the word continuity. I think that's a step forward. Maintaining and having things going on continuously, and we're not just going from one beginning to one end in the MDC characterization. We said there could be cycles and feedback, but we never really said in MDC or in Craver and Darden that there could be this continuity over time. So I think that's a nice term. But let me press you a bit now on the maintaining. I don't think you're going to be able to integrate maintaining so easily with the other two. And it's interesting to see how you're trying to do that. But I think you certainly have to be careful to say there are mechanisms that operate that don't have any maintenance or continuity in them. So you can't always have a continuity component. And you were trying to get them together, which I understood, but you should say that just could be a special case of one where there is some kind of set point being maintained, either at equilibrium or far from equilibrium. And so there's more to be said about the kinds of maintaining, the kinds of continuous processes that exist. And some of them are in fact driving towards some equilibrium state. So if you just imagine something on two sides of a membrane, there will be passive diffusion, if it's possible, to diffuse across that membrane to reach equilibrium. And that's what in MDC we called an energetic type of activity. Now that was a strange word, and we just came up with it. Peter actually came up with it. Peter Mockimer came up with that because people hadn't been talking about types of activities and naming types of activities before we began to do it, so far as we knew. And we wanted to say, what's the driver of the mechanism? And that's what activities are. They're the producers of change, the drivers of the mechanism. You don't emphasize that much, but if you do a bit more work on types of maintaining mechanisms, some of them are maintained by passive diffusion to reach equilibrium. And that will be, I don't think you're going to be able to draw one of those one of those productive underlying sort of diagrams that you're drawing in this when you've just got a lot of different things moving across a membrane to get to equilibrium. You're not going to have any causal arrows going from all of that, one activity to another activity to another activity the way you do for producing mechanisms, because they're going to be separate ions and they're not going to be causally influencing each other. I mean, there's something puzzling about why things move to equilibrium. I mean, I take it to be a fact of the world, but I find it a sort of puzzling fact. But they do, and so we need to kind of put that in as one of the driving forces in change in a mechanism. Now, Dick Buren and I were talking about this at one point, and he said, well, you know, with biological membranes, you can have either passive transport or active transport. And I take it the sodium ion pump you talked about is a case of active transport across a membrane to maintain a certain set point, whatever it is. I don't know if it's equilibrium in that case or it's off from equilibrium.
It's not equilibrium because it would I mean, otherwise you wouldn't have the diffusion and electrical forces.
Right, yeah. So you are, in fact, talking about different kinds of activities that can maintain an active transport across membranes.
And I have passive right there. So
yeah.
You're pointing out something very important here, I think, but I wonder if it's already in the example. But sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Keep going.
Okay, it just seems to me you're going to have these separate ions going and coming, and you're never going to be able to draw one of my producing diagrams. And that's why the figure that you had, your first one here in these slides that you called integration, you had it up a minute ago. And then the paper, it was figure 10, if anyone has read the paper and has that in front of them. Yeah, that one will do. I don't think you're going to be able to get that kind of underlying producing mechanism for the set points, for the maintaining mechanisms. You think you can, but I don't think it fits. So that's a question to you. Whether you really think you can integrate these three kinds as much as you think you can.
Yeah. All right, thanks. That's really cool. Very good comment, I think. So let me start with emphasizing that I don't mean we can always have integration in the way I presented it. And certainly I don't think that we can construe any producing or underlying mechanism in terms of maintaining. If anything, then the other way around. We can spell out maintaining as producing or underlying. But I mean, your objection was at exactly that, so that you think I probably can't draw a producing diagram for the resting membrane potential, right? So that's the question. Does that really work?
If I understand that case well enough, is that the one with the green
that's
channels going, with things going back and forth? Right. I don't see how that's producing. How do you see that as producing?
I would see that as, so the way you can construe this as producing, oh, it doesn't help if I point at the screen, I need to use my mouse, sorry. So we have the leakages, so sodium leaks in, and that's a lot, and potassium leaks in and out, and it doesn't matter so much. So what the pump has to do is get some of the sodium back out, and that's active. So I wonder, so the first thing you said in your comment was it's problematic to have both active and passive processes in the same picture. I'm not sure it is, because you could just say the activity of the entity is to flow in and to flow out, or to get in and get out, and then it doesn't matter if it's pumped or not. And the pump itself, this active channel, would just be another entity that's then an element of a causal chain. I think it's a matter of what you, it's like in causal modeling, it's a matter of what you construe as your entity or your variable, and then you have to draw the edges accordingly. So the active passive, I think, isn't so much of an issue. But you still might be right that it's not as easy as I try to draw it with the producing. So let me just try to rephrase the idea once more. So the way, let's use the pictures, because I just think that's useful. I work visually.
It's one of the things I love about this mechanism work, because they're often represented by diagrams.
Yeah, but it can also be very distracting, so one has to be careful. So let's say this is the resting membrane potential, and now you have the ion flying out, or let's just focus on sodium, because the potassium just leaks anyway. So potassium goes out, the pump is active, it drives it back in, and then flows out again, and you have the pump being active, and it drives it back in. Well, it doesn't matter so much if it's 3 or 4 or 1 blobs here. And then if you just say, okay, resting membrane potential at time t1, sodium in, sodium out, sodium in, no, the other way around, sodium in, sodium out, resting membrane potential again.
But the problem with that diagram is there are other channels doing it at the same time. So when you try to draw these single lines, then the previous diagram is more like ours, so not surprisingly, I like it better. And this one, it seems to me, obscures that you have these independent entities acting.
That's true. It looks like it's independent, and it's not. That's true.
Right. There's something about maintaining. I mean, that set point in the middle is a kind of abstract entity of some sort. It's a variable. It's a value of a variable. And I don't like to put variables in my mechanism diagram. So that's always been puzzling to me of what exactly that middle thing is, because if you go back to your previous slide, see, this one is pretty good because you've got sodium going out and coming in, and you could talk about the channel that's driving it and the forces, the energetics of taking it out and bringing it in. But what is that thing in the middle? And you've got to talk about all these other independent channels doing it continuously, but yet being able to maintain that concentration in the middle.
So I think, so you're definitely right. This thing here is more abstract than this blob here and then this blob here.
Right. And I think different kind of thing, maybe. I don't know.
Pardon? What did you say?
It may be a different kind of thing.
That's what I'm saying. Like, it's a different kind of thing. And one of the reasons why I think this is such an abstract thing is because the whole diagram is like this is trying to represent a whole bunch of stuff going on, not necessarily exactly at the same time, but that it's like a lot of stuff that could potentially be going on. If you think of standard regulatory diagrams, then you have also something measuring, and then something adjusting, and then something measuring again. And it's not that you're actually measuring, then adjusting, and then measuring again, but it's more like it's cyclic, but it's also continuous. And I think that's maybe the source of the abstraction here, that the whole thing is collapsed over time. This collapses a whole bunch of different things that could be happening. I mean, it's not that all of the disturbing forces are occurring in the same way at the same time all the time. That's part of the beauty of a maintaining mechanism is, well, when it meets a disturbance, then it reacts. So the membrane potential is stable or is maintained at rest, yes, but also it's reinstantiated after the action potential. And it may be, well, if you have an electric pulse or a stimulation, that afterwards it's also maintaining the resting state again. And that's the resting potential, sorry. And this is one of the reasons, because there are so many more functions, it seems to me, in maintaining mechanisms than there are in just underlying mechanisms or productive mechanisms. It's less focused. It has much more. And that's what I was trying to get at with, okay, let's just suppose we were just focusing on one of those arms here. And then, provided we're not currently looking at any influences between them, which is something else I do in the paper, then we can unfold it. But you're right, it's not going to be isolated like that. This is idealized. And it's not exactly the same blob. You should maybe have A, B, C, and then this is, X can be A, B, C, D, whatever. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay, well, I think you're saying a lot of correct and good things about maintaining mechanisms, and it was this. If you look back at what we said, a little bit of what we said about energetic activities, which are not a property of any given entity. Mm-hmm. Some people think that activities can just be a causal property of an entity, and that the energetic one, that is not true at all. Because these are all these different entities maintaining that set point. So I think you're thinking about it in correct ways, and I'll look forward to your thinking about it more.
Thank you.
like the presentation and also the paper. It's very neat and clear. And I'm sympathetic to virtually everything of what you say. I would make two points, two points rather than real questions. The first one is that I would like to push you more towards in the direction of my work actually on model pluralism. The point is that, as far as I understand, so basically, and correct me when I'm wrong, when I get your position wrong, is that you want to say that we can achieve a better integrative understanding of the phenomenon if we just look at, well, not at the phenomenon, let's say the target, just to be neutral now, by focusing on different aspects of it, which are captured by distinct kinds of mechanisms that capture distinct ontological kinds in the end. So therefore we have the processes captured by underlying mechanisms, the end products, and we have the other aspect, which is this continuous activity. For now, let's just characterize it brutally in this way. My second question would be precisely on this. So, one strategy often employed in the sciences is that sometimes the target of our research is pretty complex, and there is no single model which is apt at capturing all the relevant details we want to know. Perhaps the target is multifaceted, and each facet cannot be accounted by single models. So sometimes scientists rely on multiple models. This multiple model strategy has been stressed by Weisberg or William Wimsatt in his many publications, actually. And this form of model pluralism is very helpful because so then we develop different models, which may be explanatory or not, but as far as I think you were more interested into explanatory models in this context. You're not discussing phenomenological models that don't produce explanations. So we would have the kind of things is that we would have different models, explanatory models that take into account, that accounts for different facets of the target. But you don't discuss, you don't mention much, even the word model in this paper. So I wonder whether it is a deliberate choice because there is a real distinction between this form of model pluralism that I'm sketching out and your approach, or if you would agree with me that basically what you're trying to do is to show that there are different kinds of explanatory models in mechanistic terms that captures distinct ontological kinds. So that would be my first commentary. Regarding the second...
Shall I answer that first, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
Since you separate them so neatly, I might as well take advantage of that.
Yeah.
So, in principle, I'm favorable for that view. So, I think model pluralism and having multiple models of, say, the causal mechanical structure of the world, that's in line with what I'm saying. The reason I'm not talking about models in this paper is partly a pragmatic one, namely something that I also mentioned in the talk, that within the mechanistic literature there's this ontic epistemic debate.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get into that. And I think what I'm doing here, trying to relate these mechanisms, you can give it an ontological reading that I'm talking about actual mechanisms in the world, and you can also say, well, it's a model of what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And given that I'm not committing to either the ontic or the epistemic conception here, that's a strength. So it's a deliberate choice, or I hope that's a strength. If you were to say, well, mechanistic explanations are just models of the world and they are not like actually depicting the ontological structure, they're just modeling it in different ways, then you're still stuck with the same sorts of questions about integrations as if you say, well, they depict the actual ontological structure of the world, and the question is, how do they connect? Like the integration question is the same no matter whether you go ontic or epistemic. And that's why I'm not getting into models.
Yeah, is it because at certain points I had the feeling that actually When we try to integrate, we are integrating insights that we gain by means of our explanatory models that capture some relevant thing in the word, which is the real mechanism, if we want to call it this way. And then what you're aiming at is that trying to, maybe we can also connect this work with the work of people like David Dunks talking about mutual constraining between different models and so on. But I thought maybe you should stress this a little bit more in your paper, because at certain points it generated me some confusion about this point.
Yep.
And the second question I had, a second remark, was more of an ontological type. So this is actually something that I find quite problematic in the whole mechanistic literature. Very often philosophers employ very theoretically loaded ontological and metaphysical terms, and they don't exactly explain what they mean. So let me just have a look at the way you talk, the very same way you talk. For example, when you characterize the three kinds of explananda, you said for underlying mechanisms there are finite processes. Then you mention again process when you talk about productive mechanisms. There are causal processes, again processes. When we talk about maintaining mechanisms, you talk about continuing processes. If we look at Lindley's and Carl's definition in their book about maintaining, they talk about process or property maintained. Okay. And, well, you never define actually what a process is. On the one hand, I clearly realize this is a wise strategy because there is a terrible debate about events, processes, and the like, and it's always better to stay away from that. But unfortunately, I'm not quite sure you can't stay away from that. Because one of your points is that you want to show that these distinct phenomena belong to distinct ontological kinds. That's, as far as I understand, that's the point. So when we are talking about maintaining a phenomenon, we are talking about a distinct kind, which is something different from the underlying phenomenon we want to explain by underlying mechanistic explanation. One problem I have with this process concept here is that quite often philosophers define processes precisely in terms of something that keeps on in time. I say keeps on in time because there are different understandings of that. Some people would say that a process extends in time, whereas other people would say the process persists in time.
Well, yeah.
And the problem is that if a process is something that, let's say, just takes time, just try to remain as neutral as possible, then I'm afraid the underlying and maintaining distinction might collapse, actually. It's not so clear-cut as you draw it. It's intuitively, I clearly understand where you're driving at, and I'm sympathizing with that, but I'm afraid that when we come up with providing and articulating an account, a well-defined account, things becomes more messy. And the same happens with the causal process. A related issue, which seems to be this further away, but actually I think is pretty much related with that, as you know, there is still no convincing distinction account of the underlying and causal distinction. So prima facie, I would also say that an underlying mechanistic explanation is distinct from a causal one because in the latter case we have a causal chain of events that culminates with an end product. But again, the constitutive mechanistic relation is also sometimes characterized in terms of causation. So, and I think that the ontological boundaries between the different kinds of phenomena you're talking about are much blurrier than you think. And this might actually engender might actually threaten your whole distinction here. Pretty sure, yes, I made my point, but I
was wondering if we were keep going.
Yeah. No, it's okay.
But I think your worry is closely linked to what Dan was saying in his second question earlier. And I think that I should emphasize again. So first of all, thanks for pointing this out. I think it's a good thing to reflect more on, okay, what's exactly the issue with processes here. And I think it's worth pointing out that in any of the three cases I discussed, I do have causal chains or causal processes. I could as well talk about causal chains somewhere. And the way I conceive of processes here is just a chain of events that are causally linked with one another. That's all. I don't want anything more fancy. And I think that's, well, and I hope it would be sufficient to make that clear. But let's see. So I have these causal chains in any of the three diagrams. So if I have the produce, then I have blob, 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 and then the phenomenon. Mm-hmm. If I have maintain, which is still up here on the screen, I have these blobs going around and then the phenomenon. So it's going from the phenomenon to the phenomenon. And if I have the maintain diagram, I have it here as well as this causal chain in there. So in all of these explanations, what I'm actually citing to explain something could be the same causal process. It's with the death and dying. I would describe the same causal process, but the relation to the thing I'm trying to explain is different. The thing I'm trying to explain is the outcome of that causal process, so the thing in the end, or you could say a higher level description or the overall function of that causal process. And then there's the higher level phenomenon. And if you take the higher level phenomenon and you look at the discovery strategy and say, well, it's based on decomposition, what do you do? Well, you open it up, you look what are the parts, what are their activities, and then you describe that, you put the end and describe the causal chain. So it's not so much that the explanations that you give are different, but it's their relation to the phenomenon you're trying to explain. So it's the relation between that causal chain you were citing somewhere in your explanation and the red thing. Like where's the red dot?
Yeah.
Does it?
Yeah, I'm not sure it helps, but I can just, I see there's also a pretty complex problem, so I cannot hope you can just so fix it right in a second. But another point, it would be worth having a look at the literature on taxonomies of different kinds of events. It might be helpful here. There is a substantial literature. Of course, the Stanford Encyclopedia is a good way to start. So there are distinctions between activities, achievements, performances, states, and so on. There are different kinds of events. So this might be worth having a look at.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah. Thank you so much again. That was a great talk. I think I have two very short questions, I hope.
Please.
So the first question has to do with the way that you began the talk in describing the three types of mechanisms, and the way that each of them provided a different gloss for the kind of filler term responsible for. And so when you describe etiological mechanisms, you gloss responsible for as what is the cause of. With constitutive mechanisms, you gloss responsible for as something like what constitutes or composes the target phenomenon. And then with maintaining mechanisms, I was wondering, could you give a quick gloss for what responsible for stands in that case? Because it didn't seem to have a natural term fit there like the other two. So do you have something on offer that is a quick gloss for responsible for in maintaining mechanisms?
So my quick answer to that would be, so first of all, thanks for the question. I think it's a really good one. And you caught me on something that I haven't actually yet in the paper, and something that I should make explicit there. So I think that for maintain, that's my quick answer now, depending on whether you're looking at a stable state or a continuing process, it will be the analog. So it will be, for the continuing process, it will be the same as with the underlying mechanism, and for the stable state, it will be the same as with the producing mechanism. So remember that table that I had in the end? So I would say another way to gloss the tables here would be the responsible relation here. This is this column tells you the sort of the kind of responsibility. The etiological, either non-iterative or iterative, and constitutive, again, either non-iterative or iterative continuum. So that's my quick reply.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the other question I had to do with maintaining mechanisms, and you talked a lot about the way in which the mechanism is responsive or capable of returning to a state, but when you were describing maintaining mechanisms, you highlighted that there are two aspects to maintaining mechanisms. Mm-hmm. The first being the detection of the perturbance, and the second being the way in which the mechanism responds systemically or cyclically to that perturbance. Could you say a little bit about how the detecting aspect of that fits into these diagrams? Because you didn't seem, in those systems, I mean, the one where there seemed to be detection systems seemed to be in the way that the E. coli was responsive to lactose. But that was I thought that was an etiological mechanism example and not a maintaining mechanism example. So could you talk about like the way in which detection fits in? And I guess I'm thinking of like even really simple mechanisms like the walk governor, where the detection and the maintenance seem to be inextricably bound sometimes.
Yeah. So again, a very good question. And I think it ties in nicely with Lindley's earlier question, saying that, well, somehow it doesn't seem to be so simple. And maybe you're giving here a reason why it might not be so simple to redraw the maintaining mechanism as producing or repetitive producing mechanisms. So by way of attempting to kind of make all of this work, actually there are three things going on in maintaining. There is the disturbance itself, then the detection of the disturbance, and then the correction for it. And the diagrams don't really have the detection right now. It looks like there's the disturbance and then the correction. Now, but if we look at the lactose metabolism case, I think that's actually very illuminating. So to answer your question about that, it's an example for all three of the mechanisms. It's an example where we have one mechanism in the world, and depending on what we take to be the explanandum, we will describe a maintaining mechanism or an underlying or producing one. So in this case, when we are looking for the maintaining mechanism, we would have the explanandum would be, say, the levels or the equilibrium of the levels of lactose and the enzyme that's splitting it. So, and the fact that they are only present together, that's the thing that's being maintained. So if there's no lactose present, no need to be able to split it. If there is lactose present, well, you gotta have that enzyme because it's gonna be useful. Now the question you were asking is about detection. So we have this transcription would be our, well, it's not really a disturbing factor. It's the transcription is the response to the presence, and the detection of the presence is the binding to the repressor. So the detection here is essentially an interaction between two parts in the mechanism or two components. So it's, yeah, that's how I would construe it right now. Does that seem plausible to you, Danny?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting and exciting because what you have is that the detection part doesn't come necessarily at the start of the mechanistic explanation. The detection is actually sort of partially downstream because of this sort of continuous operation that the transcription has to do, because it's always transcribing, and then which pathway it diverges on depends both on the presence of lactose and the availability of glucose that can just trump that if it's got the easier path to work in.
Which is another interesting feature of the maintaining mechanistic explanations, and maybe also in response to Lindley's question, that's interesting to see. Well, the difference here is not just that these seem to be more abstract somehow, but also that explanation doesn't necessarily start here and end here, but it can start here and end here. Or it can start maybe here and end here, or there. So there seem to be different sections of the processes you can be looking at with maintaining. But I haven't worked this out clearly. This is just a hunch now from the discussion. So you're right. This is really exciting. So I'm going to look into this more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a really silly comment, really silly one, is that I'm not really sure. Well, usually one of the things that I was very impressed about mechanistic literature is that Bechtel, I think about Bechtel especially, but also in MCD, there is a lot of emphasis on diagrams. And you do use a lot of diagrams in your paper and in your presentation, which is very cool, I think. Now, I suspect that some kind of mechanism are, among the triad, you have presented the first two kinds of mechanisms are quite easy to depict on diagram, or at least relatively easily compared to maintaining mechanisms. And I'm wondering if you can really do with b-dimensional graphic representation when we can.
Oh, you probably can't.
So what are the alternatives? Three-dimensional models?
Some that are easy to draw. That's the problem. So that's one of the things that I alluded to when I mentioned the maintaining diagram being collapsed. So really what you want here, you want to have this in addition to a temporal dimension. So you want a whole bunch of these, like one behind the other in a row, and then a temporal arrow going that way. So that's what you would want. You want all the different, and that's also tying in with Lindley's comment earlier. This is, you have a lot of things going on at the same time, and then over time, you have a lot of those different components acting at different, to a different degree when you make something. So there might be lots of lactose over here, then you need lots of lactose metabolism, but a little later you need less because a lot of the lactose is already metabolized, and then, I don't know, you don't have any anymore, and you shut down the whole thing. So what you would need, I think, something that has, more than one dimension. Also here, with this integration, I said you can have the different the different stages of a mechanism. You could also try and say, well, take something like this guy over here, and to that add a temporal dimension. And if you add a temporal dimension, you could put them left to right, or you could put them behind one another. And then you have multiple realization as well, which would probably add another dimension. It's an issue I haven't even talked about. So the graphical representations are tricky, and also I think they can be misleading. That's what I said earlier, because they make things look so simple and then it's really not. But still, I think they are super useful.
Yeah, I was thinking about a freaky pragmatic concern and proposal. Like, I sometimes use animated GIF in my presentation, and when I do that, I look silly. But now I'm wondering, given that most of us are reading stuff on the laptops rather than printing it, well, Alfredo is an exception here because he printed the paper, but I'm wondering whether we should begin to learn how to do animated GIF in order to represent the temporal dimension in mechanisms. I got to think about it, just a suggestion, sorry.
But, I mean, who said that earlier? I think it was then mentioning dynamical models as well. So it's already there, and I think Lindley in some of her recent work also, if you look at development, temporal dynamics is super important. And in Dan's first question, what came out was that you don't have to look at how the mechanism now operates. You have to situate it in how it came about, it came to be. And then that also adds yet another aspect to it and yet another reason, well, that looking at the dynamics would be useful. So yeah, I think looking at dynamics is super insightful. A lot of the models for, or mechanistic models for something like glucose metabolism, just search the web, there are going to be animated pictures, but I just, I don't like them in presentations that much because I think they are distracting. But I guess that depends on the person. For me, having like arrows and then being able to point at the different things and having a description that goes through one of the other stepwise still useful. But yeah, there's loads of animated models and they're super useful. Sure.